So how do our eyes work? Well, a little bit about the structure of the eye. It's actually a very complicated device. You might think about 4 muscles that work your eye, pulling them left, pulling them right, pulling them up and pulling them down. But actually there's 2 more muscles that actually allow your eye to rotate. You can see this if you look at yourself in a mirror and tilt your head one way or the other. Look closely at your eyeballs. You should see your eyeball stays more or less flat while your head tilts around. You've actually got muscles here that rotate the eyeball. And your brain is very good at linking up what the inner ear says about which way down is and what the eyes say about what it's looking at, and your brain does an amazing job of putting those things together. Inside the eye itself, we're really interested in how we see things. What happens is light coming into the eye gets bent by the cornea and lens system, we'll talk about in a minute, gets refracted, and this works like a lens and focuses an image on the retina. It actually makes a real image. This is effectively, the retina is effectively the screen for what you're seeing. Now, the different pieces here, the cornea actually does most of the bending of the light, most of what has to happen to make the light come in right. The lens just adjusts that so that the focal point, the focal length of the whole system is correct to get an image to form on the retina. And the eyeball has some length so that there is enough distance between the lens and the screen for that to happen. You can't just put the screen right up here next to the lens because you wouldn't get a real image. You get a virtual image because you're within the focal length. You've got to get over here. And of course that means that the image on your retina is actually upside down, because a real image from a convex lens, a real image is inverted. Now there are other pieces here. The pupil is just a gap in the middle of the iris. The iris is actually a circular muscle, and that's the one you see when you look at your eye. And that circular muscle can pull in tight when there's lots of light, so there's a small hole, or can relax and let a lot of light in when there's not much light around. That's the job of the iris. The lens is actually pulled, when the muscles on the lens pull tighter, it actually fattens the lens. The muscles are kind of attached to the back of the lens. So when you want to focus on something close, and we'll come back to that in a minute, when you want to focus on something close, the lens muscles pull, and that fattens the lens out, which bends the light more. In between the cornea and the lens is the aqueous humor. It's a watery liquid. Actually, the liquid inside the eyeball is also pretty watery, but it does have some extra proteins and things in it. So we call it the vitreous humor in here. It's another fluid. When you come to dissect the eye, you can go in through the cornea and get the aqueous humor out. The cornea, from the bull's eye that you are likely to be dissecting, the cornea is usually quite opaque by the time you get it. The aqueous humor is usually still pretty transparent. The vitreous humor often ends up with bacteria growing in it. So by the time you get to it, A, it's no longer transparent, it's now quite dark, and B, it's usually quite smelly. So be ready for that. The other interesting thing about this system is the retina here is inside the eyeball. For us to get that information and take it to our brain, it has to travel through the retina itself and out into the optic nerve. And so you actually have a blind spot here, which in class I'll go through with you, help you to find the effects of what happens. Your retina is actually doing some of the visual processing. And I find that quite amazing. Effectively, the retina, which is made up of nerve cells, is a part of your brain, but it's inside your eyeball. And it's doing image processing here already. So much so that by the time it gets to your brain, your brain's figured out and made up some stuff about what's happening here, because you can't actually see any visual information here. We say you have the blind spot. Now, I just flicked forward. The various parts of this system have different optical properties, in particular different refractive indices. The cornea is 1.38. The watery liquid is very, very watery. It's 1.33. The lens has a higher refractive index. That's just describing how they're going to bend the light at each of those interfaces. But in practice, we usually treat this whole system as one effective lens.